Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Marcus Sadu, and today we've got a really special episode for you, or special to me specifically because my nutritional hero is on the podcast. I've been following Robb Wolf for years and years now, and I have to say that I have learned more about nutrition and just all of this lifestyle stuff via Robb, more so than anybody else in the industry. He's one of my favorite people. I think he's got a super balanced opinion, super smart dude. So really excited to bring this pod to you guys. Now, we actually kicked off our conversation by talking a little bit about Robb's health and his current sort of setup as far as nutrition goes and movement and all that sort of good stuff. So we have a bit of a conversation about that, which I think you'll find interesting. And then we dig into all things salt. So there are a few aspects of this conversation that are slightly more technical, but Robb does an awesome job of explaining complex processes in an understandable way. So stick with it. It will make sense, I promise. As far as specifics go, we dig into how salt originally got a bad health rap to begin with, and we determine the differences between salt, what we commonly call salt, and sodium, and whether they're actually the same thing or not. Why your body needs salt to begin with, like what's the point of it, why do we need it, and why you actually might want to be aware of your intake, and also why if you eat a healthier diet, you might actually need to supplement with more salt. So we get into how much you should actually consume, how you might want to track that, and then a fun little aside as far as using salt to prevent and or cure a hangover. So I think you guys will find that interesting as well. Let's dig right in. Robb, for the folks who may not be familiar with your work, can you just let us know how you got into all this health and fitness stuff to begin with, man?
Oh, yeah. And it's funny. I feel like an old guy that tells the same story again and again, and I'm not totally sure if I've already told it to you. So it's kind of funny. But I was a cancer and autoimmunity researcher a very long time ago, was considering like a conventional medical school route, looked into naturopathy, was considering a PhD process. And it was right around this time that I developed some really serious health problems. I had ulcerative colitis so bad that, at 26, 27 years old, they wanted to cut out significant lengths of myself. And I was sufficiently steeped in medical practices at that point that I knew that was kind of a bad beginning. Like if you have to do that, then it can save your life. But like over the long haul, just not great outcomes in many regards. And so I started really poking around trying to figure out what an alternative to my situation might be. And that's where this idea of a paleo type diet, ancestral eating, got on my radar. And that was back in 1998. And it wasn't too long after that, around 2000, 2001, that I was poking around on the interwebs, and I found this kind of wacky workout called CrossFit. And I started doing it with one of my buddies, Dave Warner, who is a retired Navy SEAL. And before we knew it, maybe like 3-4 months down the road, we had about 12, 15 people working out with us in his garage each morning. We were like, hey, this is kind of fun. Maybe we should like do this. And so I reached out to the Glassmans, the founders of CrossFit, and just they were familiar with us. Like I had hung out on their message board and stuff like that a fair amount, but I just said, hey, we would like to open a gym, would like to call it CrossFit. May we do that? And they were like, yes, go be achieve. And that was the first CrossFit affiliate, which was CrossFit North in Seattle. And about 6 months after that, I had a chance to move back down to Chico, California, where I did my undergrad. And I opened what was then the fourth CrossFit affiliate in the world. And, I worked for CrossFit for a good number of years. And it was just a fascinating experience because I could work with everybody from like police, military, fire, elite athletes. But my real passion was helping people who had significant health issues, in particular autoimmunity and GI related problems. And it's probably because I continue to tinker and try to refine my health dealing with those same types of issues. And it was cool because although it's fun to work with kind of elite athletes and whatnot, I kind of felt like I was more of a speed bump for those folks. Like my main role for them was just trying to keep them from not killing themselves with the overtraining and just have them show up fresh on game day. Whereas somebody that had type 2 diabetes or a raging autoimmune condition, if we could get out in front of that and change that disease process, it could save their lives. And so that just felt a lot more fun and meaningful. And that's kind of been the work that I've been doing now for coming up on 22 years, I guess.
That's amazing, man. And I think it'll be helpful for folks to hear that you actually continue to tinker with your nutrition, training, sleep, and you're just sort of, it's a moving target, right? And you're continuing to modify things in order to sort of look, feel, and perform your best.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for good or ill, the things that I figure out, I tend to respond the least well to out of anybody that I work with. And so I'm literally kind of like the toughest patient. And Chris Kresser is a very good friend of mine, and we have very similar backgrounds. We did Thai boxing in our youth. Both of us were pretty healthy until we caught gut bugs traveling, and that was kind of the precipitating moment for me really developing terrible GI problems. Was a case of Giardia that even after that resolved, like I just have never quite been right. And so, yeah, I mean, I've tinkered with everything like resistant starch and intermittent fasting, different probiotics, prebiotics, carnivore. And I just continue to tinker and try to improve things. And one of the biggest improvements I've had in the last maybe 10 years, we moved to the hill country of Texas. And I don't know if it's just being closer to the equator, but whenever we would travel, we'd go to Nicaragua or Central America or somewhere like that, and my digestion would improve and my carb tolerance would improve. And then I would go back where we've lived for quite some time prior to this, Reno, Nevada. And although it's sunny and kind of a desert environment there, my health just wasn't as good. My digestion wasn't as good. And it's interesting being in this Texas Hill Country area has improved my digestion in probably the most significant thing that I've done in probably 15 years. Like it's the most qualitatively beneficial thing that I've done. And again, I'm not entirely sure what the mechanism is there. Is it sunlight exposure? Is it heat? Is it the latitude and that interplaying with like my circadian biology? I really don't know what it is, but I do know that I'm now healthier and have better digestion than I've had in quite some time.
That's great news, man. Now, if you mentioned a few factors, but if you were to sort of hypothesize maybe, I don't know, the top three things, what do you think it is? Because you mentioned that Reno also had sun. So I don't know how different it is in Texas.
It's really interesting because technically Reno is a sunnier place than New Braunfels, where I live here in Texas. So Reno is like the 6th or 7th sunniest place in the United States, somewhere around there. New Braunfels is like 34th or something. Like there's a lot more cloudy days, overcast days. We get these kind of monsoon periods and stuff like that. It's definitely warmer in general here, but I think it might be kind of a latitude driven deal. Like the day night differences are less here than what they are further north. And even when I lived in Seattle, it was even worse. Like it seems like the further away from the equator I get, like the poorer my health is. And it's really ironic because I'm like 90% Northern European and then 10% Native American. And so you would think that just from a genetic standpoint, I would be reasonably well adapted to kind of like far northern latitude type environments. But the closer to the equator you get me, the better I do. And I've heard a lot of other people mention kind of similar outcomes, but there's, again, I don't think it's just sunlight, because one could argue that I got as much or more sunlight in Reno as what I receive here. It is warmer here, but it's either place. I still spent the bulk of my time inside. Like I try to be outside as much as I can. So I really don't know what it is. And there is some literature that you can look at. And this goes back to autoimmune conditions, just kind of a north-south latitude gradient. As people get closer to the equator, we tend to see lower rates of autoimmune conditions. That's usually attributed to sunlight exposure, vitamin D levels, and all the kind of knock-on benefits of vitamin D production. But I just don't know, and I'm not sure how to experiment with it to kind of suss out what the mechanism that's driving that.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm actually originally from Vancouver, Canada, so super close to Seattle, and I find I just do better in a warmer sort of environment as it is with more sun exposure and stuff like that. But there are just so many confounding factors that it's tough to parse out what it really is.
Right. I will throw one thing out there that's interesting. Whenever historically we've gone to a more equatorial region or tropical region, it's usually on vacation or almost exclusively on vacation. And so in the back of my head, I would think maybe it's just lower stress. But when we moved to Texas, it's been a great move, but our house in Reno sold in 6 hours. And we were completely unprepared for that. And so we had to super hustle to find a place here. A bunch of back and forth travel. When we were moving here, the movers in Reno set our front yard on fire there.
Holy shit.
Yeah, lost a bunch of our gear. And when we arrived here, we started homeschooling our 2 daughters, which has been both awesome. But the long and short is that the last 6 months have arguably been the most stressful in my life. And still my digestion has, by and large, been significantly better. So there's something really wacky and powerful there. And I think I at least ticked the box that it was like, okay, it's something other than just stress, because it's been like the stress apocalypse the past 6 months. And still my digestion has largely been better.
Yeah, it's fascinating, man. And I mean, I guess the benefit is, hey, it's working. So whatever is working, just keep at it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right, man. So kind of shifting gears into our topic today and salt, I find it really interesting to sort of look at how we got to this point with some of our societal beliefs around specific nutrition concepts. So how did salt originally get a bad rap?
Man, it's interesting. So if you look at the increase in, say, like cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome that started happening in the, say, like mid 1900s, there was an awareness that maybe something to do with cholesterol and lipoproteins was at play in cardiovascular disease. There was definitely a strong correlation with elevated blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, like an often kind of overlooked feature of the atherogenic process is we only get atherogenic plaquing on the arterial side of our vascular system. You don't get this on the venous side where the pressure is comparatively low. And we tend to get the plaquing in these areas where we get what's called non-laminar flow, where there's turbulent flow, and that turbulence could cause damage to the vascular endothelium. And it's a super contentious topic, like what exactly the precipitating factor is in the atherogenic process. But I'm kind of in the camp that it's some sort of insult to the vascular endothelium, and then we get an attempt at recovery and repair, and that can kind of spin out of control, and it's kind of off to the races. But one of these definite confounders or correlates in cardiovascular disease is elevated blood pressure. So with elevated blood pressure, the body is tending to retain sodium, and when we retain sodium, we retain water. So there was this reasonable first order thinking that if we reduce sodium intake, that it will reduce blood pressure. And if we put people on different types of diuretic drugs, it tends to reduce blood pressure because we're causing these folks to shed sodium and therefore water. But the interesting thing is there have been a number of studies looking at like the DASH diet and different sodium restricted diets, and it just doesn't change blood pressure hardly at all. There's a small group of people that are what we call sodium sensitive hypertensives, and they really do seem to have a remarkable response to increased blood pressure from sodium intake. But even then, we could maybe make the case that the primary driver, the main mechanism, is actually elevated insulin levels, chronically elevated insulin levels, hyperinsulinemia, causing an upregulation in a hormone called aldosterone, which causes us to retain sodium. And when we retain sodium, we increase our fluid volume, and that can make blood pressure go up. So we have this good mechanism for, like elevated blood pressure being a problem with regards to cardiovascular disease. Sodium is certainly a factor in that, but the way that we address that may not be. It historically, the recommendations for reduced sodium intake just haven't budged the needle on actual blood pressure. Low carb diets have a remarkable improvement in blood pressure, but that's maybe something that we'll talk about a little bit later. But sodium definitely got implicated as a potentially problematic nutrient, and when we look at our food system, where do we find the bulk of sodium in our foods? In highly processed foods. And so I think that it's pretty clear at this point that processed foods are clearly problematic from a health perspective. If for no other reason than they're super nutrient or calorically dense, they taste really good, and we can overeat them very easily, which can lead into this hyperinsulinemic state. But the fact that sodium is really tightly tied to processed foods is something that, we're told avoid processed foods, and therefore by kind of implicit to that, avoid sodium. That all makes sense, and decreasing our processed food intake makes a lot of sense. But sodium kind of got thrown under the bus, not decoupled from everything else that's going into processed foods. There was a study done not that long ago in type 2 diabetic heart patients where they looked at the sodium intake of this population and the relative morbidity and mortality for these folks. And what was interesting, if you can imagine a U-shaped curve where on the left-hand side, on the bottom, going out on the x-axis, we have increasing sodium intake, and then on the y-axis, we have increasing morbidity, mortality. At very low sodium intakes, less than 2 grams a day, which is what the recommendations are from the American Medical Association, American Dietetics Association. At very low sodium intake, we saw a remarkably high rate of morbidity and mortality. And then when we got down to about 5 grams a day of sodium intake was the low ebb of morbidity and mortality. And then you had to get out to about 8 to 10 grams a day. Like that right-hand side was really flat and slow to increase, but you had to take in about 8 to 10 grams of sodium per day in this diabetic heart patient population to have morbidity and mortality as bad as the 2 gram or lower per day folks. And so this was one of the big cracks in the narrative around sodium intake, that it's inherently problematic for us. So when we look at both the sodium restriction diet interventions and the fact that they don't really improve morbidity and mortality, and they don't reduce blood pressure, and then we overlay that with this other study that looked at the fact that a low ebb of morbidity and mortality occurred at about 5 grams of sodium intake per day, it paints a very different picture.
Yeah, totally, man. And I think salt has sort of been that guilty by association sort of dealio with processed foods, it seems. So we also tend to use the terms salt and sodium interchangeably, but there is a difference. So can you share that with us?
Yeah, so generally the sodium that most folks consume is in the form of sodium chloride, which is sea salt, table salt. But we can have other sodium sources, sodium bicarbonate, sodium citrate. Some foods have sodium bound in these other kind of ionic forms with either short chain organic acids or things like bicarbonate. But by and large, it's, when we say salt, we're talking about sodium chloride, table salt, and that is where we get the bulk of our intake from. And it's maybe worth mentioning that by weight, if we had a teaspoon of sea salt, it's about 60% chloride by weight and about 40% sodium. So when we're talking about the fact that a low point of morbidity and mortality for that study that I referenced was around 5 grams per day, that ends up equating to about 4 to 5, maybe even a little bit more teaspoons of table salt per day, which is quite a lot. And so it's interesting because we've been told to really reduce sodium intake. Folks that follow kind of whole food based diets, whether it's paleo or vegan or low carb or what have you, generally the fact that you are removing processed foods, you are reducing the bulk of the sodium intake. So a lot of people have perhaps inadvertently reduced their total sodium intake by doing something which is smart, shifting towards more whole unprocessed foods. But for many people, they seem to feel better and operate better with a pretty significant addition of sodium to the diet.
Yeah, man, that's an interesting one because I feel like when people shift towards a more whole foods based approach, it might sound counterintuitive, but they actually need less water because that whole foods approach brings along more water via the whole foods, and then their salt intake goes down, but then their water intake tends to increase as well because, water is quote unquote healthy. And so the more, the better. And so it's sort of an interesting compounding situation here where you change to a more healthful diet, but your sodium intake just plummets and you might see different issues pop up.
Exactly. And, when you look in like Guyton's textbook of medical physiology for the term hydration, it's not just water. Hydration is H2O plus electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And somewhere along the line, the notion of hydration got completely decoupled from the solutes that are there. And around the 1950s, 1960s, sodium kind of fell out of vogue, and there was, like some public health recommendations to drink more water and whatnot. And this was right when running and marathoning became pretty popular, but it was really rare in the past for, say, like military boot camps or double days at football practices for kids to get heat exhaustion, for them to die from the overconsumption of water, because there was a recommendation usually to take salt tablets and then drink water to thirst. But when folks started recommending like the 8 glasses of water a day, 8-ounce glasses of water a day, just uniform across the board, absent any additional electrolytes, and people would take that recommendation and then kind of put it on steroids when they were doing marathons, triathlons, similar athletic events. What appears to happen is these folks are maybe already what we would call hyponatremic. They may already be low sodium and low electrolytes as a start. And then when they throw more water on top of that, they're actually making things worse. They would be better off not drinking anything than consuming the water when they're in that situation where they've really severely diluted their electrolyte pool. And it's interesting, like you cannot find an example in the literature of someone accidentally dying from dehydration. Like when we get thirsty, we know it. And we, short of like being locked in a room or trapped in a canyon with your foot wedged between a rock, like people don't die from dehydration, but routinely people overhydrate and can either end up in the hospital or dead from diluting their electrolyte pool. So it's funny because talking about this stuff, you are really the crazy person. I mean,
totally,
doctors, dietitians, they're just freaked out. But this is very evidence-based stuff. Like it shouldn't be controversial. It's really well supported in the literature. Even the American Council of Sports Medicine, ACSM, which is a very kind of orthodox mainstream outlet, their sodium recommendations for athletes in hot or humid environments starts at 7 to 10 grams per day, which is, people just can't believe it. And so I receive a lot of pushback on these topics, and floating that ACSM paper. Like, people have accused me of like fabricating that thing, and I'm like, no, this is from their website, and so it's so ingrained in us that sodium is bad, and kind of a loss of awareness of the interplay between both water and our electrolytes, and that need for balance between the two.
Oh, that's so important, man. Now, sodium is responsible and plays a part in, an absolute shit ton of processes in the body. But can you just share with us sort of a few of the most pertinent points that folks should know about when it comes to their salt intake and why they might want to be more aware of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, really, you could make the case that the most critical feature for sodium, like the fact that we live, is driven by sodium-potassium pumps. And there tends to be more sodium outside of cells, more potassium inside of cells. And these cells burn energy, produce ATP to create a gradient. So there's more sodium in one area, more potassium in another area. And these gradients, then, there's a tendency for these ions to leak back through specific channels. And in the process of doing that, this is how we generate nerve impulses. This is how we initiate muscle contractions. And magnesium and calcium are super important in this process too. So I'm kind of overly simplifying that, but they're significant players also. But if you want to kill someone really quickly, two of the things that you could perturb would be pH balance. Like, our pH balance is very tightly regulated, and if it goes too high or too low, the person's going to die. And maybe the only thing that is secondary to that is our electrolyte balance, in particular sodium potassium levels. So if you want your heart to beat, if you want nerve impulses to go from your brain to your fingertip, or your brain to your heart for that matter, we have to have appropriate electrolyte levels, in particular sodium, from this kind of priority perspective. It's worth noting that we're told to consume a lot of potassium, and we should get potassium because we should be eating a lot of whole unprocessed foods. But if we overconsume potassium, that will kill us much faster than over-consuming sodium. We have a much broader buffer zone. Like, the difference between therapeutic versus toxic levels are much larger for sodium than they are for potassium. And it's kind of morbid, but when lethal injections are performed, generally the drug that's used is a concentrated form of potassium, and it basically causes a heart cramp, and then you're done. And so when people are experiencing muscle cramps when they're exercising, people will talk about magnesium, they'll talk about potassium. Yes, they are absolutely factors in this story, but generally the more important player in that is the sodium intake.
That was beautifully explained, man. Now, what are some of the telltale signs, practically speaking, in folks' everyday lives that they can be on the lookout for as far as not consuming enough salt?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things, like GI disturbances can be in there, cramping, muscle fatigue, lethargy, kind of foggy headedness. And the bugger with that is a zillion different things produce those same kind of fatigue, kind of outputs. Yeah. Mental fatigue, like just missing a night of sleep or what have you, can worsen that. And so the things that are indicative of kind of low sodium status or inadequate electrolyte status there's a lot of overlap with other situations, but it's also kind of interesting, so like a lot of what goes into making a hangover nasty is the disruption in our electrolyte status. And not surprisingly, if you can write your electrolyte status, although it's not a get out of jail free card for a hangover, it ends up mitigating a lot of the really nasty kind of side effects. And when folks undertake a lower carb diet, because insulin levels are low, they tend to produce less aldosterone, so they retain less sodium, and they start shedding water. And in an attempt to maintain a balance between sodium and potassium, the body will start dumping lots of potassium. And this becomes a very challenging downward spiral. And if somebody is put on a medically supervised ketogenic diet for like epilepsy, it is baked in the cake that as much attention is placed on protein, carbs, fat will be placed on sodium intake. Like it is a dietitian steeped in how to formulate a ketogenic diet for epilepsy will make damn sure that you're getting enough sodium. When people are adopting low-carb ketogenic diets from books and popular culture and just kind of learning this stuff on the internet, not remotely enough airplay is given to the fact that they need to consume adequate sodium. So a lot of the side effects that people experience from kind of even just shifting from a standard American diet to a largely whole unprocessed food diet, they can notice a lot of these symptoms. We call it the keto flu, and it can be pretty nasty in the beginning. And it can also be virtually 100% remedied just by focusing on proper sodium intake.
That's a great point, man. Yeah, because I think that people know it's like, oh, I'm in a hotter environment, I might need to consume more salt, or I'm playing a bunch of sports and sweating a lot, I might need to consume more salt. But actually a low carb diet, or maybe a keto approach, or carnivore for some folks, they're going to need to keep a closer eye on their salt intake.
Absolutely. Yep.
So having said that, you touched on this a little bit, but what are your sort of general recommendations around salt intake for average folks?
Shy of an individual who is a sodium sensitive hypertensive, these folks do need to keep an eye on their sodium intake. Although, again, I will throw in the caveat, these folks likely will benefit from a reduced carbohydrate diet because the insulin, in my opinion, is probably the primary driver for their sodium sensitivity to start off with. So even though they need to pay attention to their sodium intake, the root cause is in my opinion, the insulin levels. But beyond that, I think that using that 5 grams per day as kind of a benchmark, like I think that's a safe place for most people to operate. Interestingly, that is the minimum effect recommended level for folks on low carb and ketogenic diets when those are being medically supervised. So I think that 5 grams per day is a pretty solid place to at least start on the sodium discussion. This will curl some people's toes, but we know folks that are, kind of moderate to low carb fueled athletes, and they train really hard, and they may be in hot, humid environments. And we've seen people go 10, 15 grams of sodium a day in those situations. I haven't really seen it get much beyond that. And there is definitely a limiting factor just with GI distress at some point. Like you're going to end up with disaster pants if you go too vigorous on this, but the bracket could be anywhere from like 5 as kind of a minimum, and depending on your size, your activity level, heat, humidity, you might not be surprised to be as high as 10 to 15 grams of sodium per day.
Now, you mentioned the relationship between insulin and salt retention or salt sensitivity. Do you think that perhaps maybe salt sensitivity doesn't exist and it's because of that insulin environment, or it might just be incredibly rare?
That is my opinion. Yeah. I think it's pretty defensible that insulin is the driver in these sodium sensitive hypertensives. These are, when you look at metabolic syndrome, there's several different features to it. Some people exhibit dyslipidemia, reduced HDL, elevated LDL, elevated triglycerides, potentially elevated blood glucose levels. Some people have abdominal adiposity. They tend to store fat around the midsection. Some people show elevated blood pressure. And there's the number of things in metabolic syndrome have just kind of grown over time. But that was kind of originally the main features that kind of defined metabolic syndrome. Not everybody who is insulin resistant and showing metabolic syndrome has elevated blood pressure or is dyslipidemic or, stores fat preferentially at the kind of abdomen level. And so some people could have one of these features. And this is where it's important that when we're looking at this stuff, you try to consider everything and don't just launch in on just one finding and assume that is the driver for everything.
That makes a ton of sense, man. Now, I generally recommend that folks salt their food to taste because tracking salt intake can be a bit of a pain, and realistically, I just don't think that most folks are going to do it. But how would you recommend that folks start to keep a closer eye on their salt intake or potentially track it if someone's pretty keen?
Yeah, I mean, like Chronometer is a pretty solid option. It's funny, though. I have eaten kind of low carb ketogenic for the better part of 20 years and generally feel really good on that, but it historically struggled with kind of high motor activity like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or CrossFit or something like that. And it wasn't until I really consciously supplemented my sodium that resolved, and now I kind of have that low gear. And so I've just gotten into a habit, like in the morning I'll have either some bone broth or I'll do something like Element, and I kind of plug the gap in my sodium intake that way. I've also made a pretty good effort to include some things that are really high sodium foods like olives. Like olives are actually kind of they're really, really salty. So you don't need to do a lot of those to get 2 grams of sodium. So I've made some shifts in those directions so that I've got some kind of fallbacks that I know for sure I'm kind of ticking the adequate sodium box. And, initially, I was tracking and documenting it, and again, Chronometer is a pretty good outlet for that. But now I can just kind of tell when I'm feeling a little off, a little bit lethargic. I add sodium again, either like Element or bone broth or something like that, some olives, and I feel better almost immediately.
Gotcha, man. Now, you touched on the alcohol intake and hangovers and electrolyte balance. I don't know how often you drink, but do you have sort of like a little bit of a protocol that you use if you do have a couple too many bevies?
Yeah. So, when we formulated Element, which is this electrolyte thing that we put together, we formulated it first as a margarita base. So like the citrus salt one makes an amazing margarita base. And so I just throw one of those in a glass with like ice, tequila, soda water, and it turns out really well. And even if I'm having like a glass of wine, I'll kind of do basically about 1 gram of sodium per drink that I'm having. And I'm old and used up and have 2 kids, and so like I'm kind of a 2-drink maximum for the most part. So yeah, super cheap date. I try to drink early, try to get it done early, keep it as far away from bedtime. But I've noticed that if I'm about 1 gram of sodium per drink, I feel just markedly better. Like it's really incredible.
Oh, dude, that's super helpful and a really straightforward sort of formula, too. I think that'll be really useful for folks.
Yeah. And so just for reference, like I'm about 170 pounds. So like if you're a small female, maybe it's 1/2 to 3/4 of that. If you're a bigger dude, maybe it's a bit more, just as kind of a reference scale on that.
Very cool. Now, Chris Masterjohn has talked about having a little bit of sodium before bed in some water or something like that if folks struggle with waking up to pee in the middle of the night. Have you experimented with that at all?
Yeah, I have actually. And it's interesting because this kind of gets into some of the common the common symptoms that are associated with, say, like low carb ketogenic diets, like some people will notice disordered sleep. Some people will report what's generally categorized under adrenal fatigue, even though the better scientific term is HPTA axis dysregulation. We may see some downregulation in thyroid. And when people reduce carbohydrate intake, it's reasonable to see some degree of reduction in thyroid, because you need a certain amount of T3 to be able to process carbohydrates. So it's not entirely clear what is clinically significant there. But if people are showing clinical symptoms that, like brittle hair, flaky skin, cold lethargy, and they just ascribe that to a low carb diet, it may be that the low carb diet isn't a fit for them. But what's interesting is that consuming adequate levels of sodium addresses that aldosterone issue. And when aldosterone is an adrenal hormone, and when it's released, we release cortisol and epinephrine in lockstep with it. And those are stimulatory hormones. And so Chris's insight here is really fascinating, because if you take a little whack of sodium, then it downregulates aldosterone, and so you tend to retain a little bit more of the sodium. You tend to retain water in that interim, and you don't get that kind of adrenalized bump that would cause you to wake up. So there is some really good physiology behind it. And then more broadly, this is probably some of what is at play with the symptoms that are usually ascribed to problems related to low carb and ketogenic diets.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I think that a lot of those same symptoms were attributed to low carb itself. And then folks would say, hey, well, consume a bolus of carbohydrate pre-bed and that will improve the sleep. But if somebody wants to stick to a low carb diet and they find it more doable to just add sodium, that's so much easier.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Rob, what does a day in the life sort of look like for you right now as far as nutrition goes? What are you doing?
It's just kind of that peri-ketogenic deal. I have shifted. So I do a little bit of time-restricted eating, and I try to front-load more of my calories. And I had felt better as a consequence of that. So I'll have a really big breakfast, and it will be anywhere from like 8 to 9 a.m. And then depending on the day and whether I get in some jujitsu or some training, I may or may not have lunch. And then I will typically have dinner. Like, it would be easy for me if I didn't have kids to do a huge breakfast and then like a lunch / dinner around like 2 or 3 o'clock and be done. And I think that there would be some potentially really solid health benefits to that. And it also would be easy because it's just eating less and less prep and cleanup and all that stuff. But eating dinner with the family is kind of an important thing. So if I have a really active day, I might have a lunch, and I will typically make the lunch much larger. And then if not, then it's a dinner. And my breakfasts are just big. Like, it's 7,500 grams of protein sometimes, some vegetable matter, and then, decent whack of fat with that. And then I will just kind of, the subsequent meals reflect my activity level. So if I'm just sitting on my duff and I'm doing computer work all day, then my later meals are not really going to be all that significant. If I'm really active and getting after it that day, then I may end up, eating pretty good sized meals to kind of make up for that.
That's super interesting. So you sort of skip lunch and then ideally have a bit of an earlier dinner if possible, and then cut things off and go on to the next day.
Yeah, we're lucky. We're homeschooling the girls, and so we'll eat dinner anywhere from like 4 to 5 p.m. And I know most people are still, fighting traffic and doing all that stuff. But that's part of the reason why we actually decided to homeschool, was some things like this. And then we go for a walk after dinner. We take the dog for a walk. We get out more active. And that's been really good. And I feel good. My digestion is functioning well. It's been solid for us.
Nice, man. Now, before we get to where folks can find you, is there anything that we didn't get to today that you think that it would be helpful to leave the listeners with?
I don't think so. Like just if folks are looking for kind of an interesting performance bump, put a little bit of thought into both your carbohydrate level. Some people do really well on higher carb diets, but a lot of people seem to do better just reducing carbohydrate intake. And it doesn't mean that you need to go full keto or carnivore by any means. I'm a huge fan of all of these things, but keto has become so popular that people forgot that there's this whole spectrum of things called low carb diets, and if you were eating 600 or 800 grams of carbs a day and you were having problems and you drop it down to 150 and you're just crushing things and you feel great, it doesn't necessarily mean that dropping carbs to 5 grams a day is going to be that much better. It may actually be worse. And so I would just encourage people to kind of, it's funny because I'm defending this stuff from like all angles. Like some people are like, ketogenic diets are going to kill you. I'm like, no, they're not. But, other people will say you should have 5 grams of carb a month and intermittent fast 22 hours a day and do CrossFit twice a day, 6 days a week. And those are the people that end up like adrenalized and their hair falling out and they can't figure out what's going wrong. And it's like, dude, you took a good thing and made it ridiculous, So, I would encourage people to both consider the possibility that a little bit of tinkering with their carb intake could go a long ways. And if they do a little bit of poking around, Robb Wolf 7-Day Carb Test, I have a guide from my second book that helps you navigate a way of testing what your carb tolerance is. And it's free and it's easy to do. You just have to invest some time to do it. And then mixed into that, maybe do a little bit of tinkering with supplementing sodium, and smart times to do at least some of that would be the pre-workout period. And then like you alluded to, a little bit before bed might be helpful in addressing some sleep issues.
That's great advice, man. Now, where can folks follow you, your podcast that you just sort of switched into a new one here, Element and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so we are mainly operating off of a platform called The Healthy Rebellion. And my new podcast is called The Healthy Rebellion Radio. You can find that on iTunes and all the standard outlets. The supplement that I was talking about is called Element, LMNT, and you can find that at drinkelement.com. And we have just a ton of information there. Like if you're skeptical about all this stuff, which is fantastic, like we have a ton of scientific references and resources to help people get in and help make up their mind themselves and look at where the literature is and what does it actually say.
Amazing, man. I will link to all that stuff in the show notes, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Huge honor. Thank you.
I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Robb Wolf as much as I did. I'd highly recommend checking out his site, especially his podcast. His podcast is amazing. I'm a regular listener. I think I've listened to every episode for the last 7 years. We were actually talking about that before we started recording. You can check out Element as well, the supplement. I will link all that stuff in the show notes. I hope you guys learned a ton from this episode, and now you know sort of what to do with your salt intake moving forward. And lastly, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching or workout design with me, you can check out the link in the show notes or head over to n1fitness.com/coaching. All right, guys, I will catch you on the next one. See ya.